Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today in this video, we will have one React interview question, that is the slideshow app. So as you can see, we have the slideshow app. We have three buttons like restart button, previous and a next button. So when we are at the first slide, that is this, the React. So initially the restart button and the previous button will be disabled as because we don't have any slide beyond this. So initially both these buttons are disabled. As soon as we move on to the next slide, that is by using this button, next button, to see the restart and the previous button got enabled. As because now we have slides beyond this also, so we can go to the previous, and again if we go to the previous, these two will get disabled. And when we move to the last slide, that is this, the TypeScript, so the next button will get disabled as because we don't have anything beyond this. And again, when we go to restart, these two will get disabled. To see so how we will create this, so let's dive into our code. So I'm using a shortcut, that is RFC, to have our functional component, and we can also have our dummy data that we had here, like the slideshow data. So to have the data, we need to have array of objects like this. So we can have our data here only in the slideshow component, but that is not a good practice. We should always have our data in a separate file. So that's why I have slideshow data.js. Here I will keep my data. So let's first have our data, our dummy data. So our data would be, as we need to have an array of objects, so simply our first data, then our second data, then again third, similarly fourth, and our last data. And here we will have the name like React. So name with some detail, and similarly for this. So let me just quickly fill this dummy data as I have here. So here I have my dummy data, that is the name, that is React, similarly with the detail of that, and similarly we have Next.js, Java and all. So here we have our dummy data, and we need to export our data. So we exported our data. Now let's just quickly create the layout for this, and I already have the CSS for this as well, as I don't want to waste your time in the CSS part. I want you to focus just on the functionalities. So let me first import my CSS file, that is slideshow.css. Then let's just quickly create the layout for this. I'll have the div with class name as slideshow container. Then I will have h1, which will store this, the name. Similarly, I will have a p tag, which will hold the details, as here we have this detail. Then we will have a container for our button. Let's give the class name as button container, maybe buttons container. Then we will simply have three buttons, like the first one would be restart button, and the second button would be previous button, and then we will have our next button. Now let's have our data that we have here. So let's have our data here. So we need to import, as here we exported our data, so here we need to import the data with a curly brace, so data from our slideshow data. And how we will access this data, as this is an array of objects, and as you know, if you try to access array elements, you do that with the help of indexes. So here also we will do the same thing. So if we want to access the first element, maybe the first data, that is the React. So we will access it using data of 0 for this React. Similarly, data of 1 to access this Next.js, and similarly for the other ones with their indexes. So here we imported our data. Here also we will do the same thing. We will have their indexes, and with the help of index, we will access them. And to have the indexes, we need to have our useState hook. Then we can have our useState hook as, let's give the name of state variable as index, and the function which will update the value of this state variable, that is setIndex. So it would be useState, and initially let's give the index as 0. And as I told you earlier that h1 will hold this name. So how to access that name? Simply a curly brace, then data of 0, that is data of index, as here we have the index. So for name, data of 0 dot name, as this is the array of objects, not simply just array. Okay, so data of index dot name, and in the p tag we will have the details. So similarly a curly brace with data of index dot detail this time. So let's check whether we have our data or not. We should have our first data, as here initially the index is 0. As you can see, we have our initial data, that is the React, as we have our index 0. So now what we need to do, we only need to increment the value of this index with the help of these buttons, and with the index only we can access or all the data that we have here. So as we have 3 buttons, so simply we will have an on-click event handler, restart button. So if this button is pressed, we need to go to the first slide, as we need to restart the slideshow. So simply give the name of this function as handle restart, and here for our previous button, simply on click would be, this time let's give the name of the function as handle previous, and here for the next button, on click would be handle next. Now let's define this. So simply we will have our handle reset, and here what we need to do, we need to simply set the index to 0. It means if this button is pressed, you simply need to go to the first slide, that is the initial, that is the React one. So we will simply set the index as 0, and similarly for our handle previous, simply set index would be, as we need to go to the previous, so simply index -1, and similarly for our handle next, this time we need to set our index to +1. So index +1. It means if this previous button is clicked, then decrease our index by 1 so that we can go to the previous slide. And similarly for this next slide, if this is pressed, then we need to simply increment our index so we can move on to our next slide. So here we have our buttons. So if I press next, I'm going to the next slide, and again next, and previous, and next. And if I press this restart, so as you can see, we are redirecting to the first slide. So now what we need to do, let's give this a class as button. So class name as, let's give all the button class name as button so that we can style them. Now the only thing we need to do, we need to have somehow like disable this restart and previous and next conditionally. So how you will do? As you know, we have an attribute that is disabled. So if I set this to true, so you will see that the restart button will be disabled to see. And I have used CSS to have this cursor not allowed symbol. So we need to somehow have this true and false conditionally instead of this hard-coded true and false. How you will do? And the restart will be disabled when our index is 0 at 0. That time we need to have this true, else it would be false only. So how you will do? So let's have one variable as restart disable. So we will simply have index equal to 0. So if the index is equal to 0, this restart disable variable will hold true. So let me show you. Let me just write it down here. So if the index is equal to 0, that is initially we have the index 0. So initially it will be true as 0 will be equal to 0. So this restart disable will hold true and this true will go down here. Instead of this hard coded true, we will simply have this restart disable variable. So now initially as index is 0, it is holding true. So our disabled would be true. So see, our restart button is disabled. And as we move on to the next slide, like next, it gets enabled. So as we will move on to our next slide, this index will become 1 and it will hold false as 1 is not equal to 0. So that time the restart disable will hold false. So that's why initially it will hold true. As soon as we click the next button, we go to the next slide, it will become false. This condition will become false and here we will have false. So similarly we will have another variable as previous disable this time. So this time what we need to do, we need to have our index equal to 0. So here also, if we are at the first slide, then our index would be 0. Then it will hold true that time, the previous disable. And here also we need to have a disable attribute set to this previous disable. Initially, this restart disable and previous disable is both the variables will hold true. And as soon as the index increases, this will become false. So let me show you. Initially, both of them are disabled. As soon as we move on to the next slide, that is the first one, index become 1 and both the buttons got enabled. Now we need to do the same thing with this next button and we want the next button to get disabled when we are at the last slide, that is the length of the array of objects. So our next disable variable, when we want it to true, that is when it reaches the last slide. So we need to have the length of this. Okay. So our index would be equal to, as here we have data. So data dot length -1. Why -1 this time? As this is the array of objects and here we have 5 names like 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So the length of the array would be, so it would be 5. And as you know, array indexes start from 0. So it will be data of 0, data of 1 all the way till data of 4. So that's why we have our data length -1, because we don't want to have that error, that is array index out of bounds, as we only have this 5 data and array index starts from 0. So it will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's why I have data length, that is 5 minus 1, that will be equal to 4. And this is our last index, as here we have data of 4. So when the index is equal to the last, that is 4, that means the last slide, then we want our next button to be disabled. So this time our disabled would be only true when we are at the last slide. So our next disable that time will be holding true. So here we will have next disabled. So we have our slide swap ready. So let's just check it. So initially our restart and previous button is disabled, and as we go to the next slide using the next button, to see both of them got enabled, and see when we are at the last slide, the next button got disabled, and again the next got enabled, and these two disabled. So we have achieved the same feature. So yes, that's it for this video. Hope you understood about slide swap in React. So see you all in the next one. Till then, take care.